Christian nationalism is on the rise in America. A video essay by House of Public Discourse founder Johnny Hill.
Hello, I'm Johnny Hill, founder of the House of Public Discourse Radio.com. Is the rise of Christian nationalism just a way to legislate evil and punish the poor? On August 26, during the Republican National Convention, Vice President Mike Pence closed out his acceptance speech with a biblical sleight of hand. Speaking before a crowd at the Fort McHenry National Monument in Baltimore, he exclaimed, "Let's fix our eyes on Old Glory and all she represents. Let's fix our eyes on this land of heroes and let their courage inspire." In doing so, he essentially rewrote a passage from the New Testament's book of Hebrews. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. There's nothing new, of course, about an American politician melding religion and politics on the campaign trail. Still, Pence's decision to replace Jesus with the stars and stripes raised eyebrows across a range of religious and political persuasions. Indeed, the melding of Old Glory and Christ provided the latest evidence of the rising influence of Christian nationalism in the age of Trump. It's no longer hard to find evidence of just how deeply Christian nationalism influences our politics and policy making. During the pandemic, the Bible has repeatedly been used and distorted to justify COVID-19 denialism and government inaction, not to speak of outright repression. In late March, as cities were locking down and public health officials were recommending strict quarantine measures, one of Donald Trump's first acts was to gather his followers at the White House for what was billed as a national day of prayer to give Americans the strength to press on through death and difficulty. Later in the spring, protests against pandemic shutdowns, funded with dark money from the likes of the Koch brothers, demanded that states reopen for business and social distancing guidelines be loosened. Forget about masking of any sort. At them, printed protest signs said things like, "Even Pharaoh freed slaves in a plague and Texas will not take the mark of the beast." And even as faith communities struggled admirably to adjust to Zoom worship services, as well as remote pastoral care and memorials, President Trump continued to fan the flames of religious division, declaring in-person worship essential, no matter that legal experts questioned his authority to do so. And speaking of his version of Christian nationalism, no one should forget the June spectacle in Lafayette Square near the White House, when Trump had racial justice protesters tear-gassed so he could stroll to nearby St. John's Church and pose proudly on its steps displaying a borrowed Bible, though he flashed it to the photographers, who can doubt how little time he spent within its pages. Selling those same pages is another matter entirely. After all, a Bible he signed in the wake of that Lafayette Square event is now on sale for nearly $40,000.
To understand how power is wielded in America by wealthy politicians and their consortium of extremists in 2020, you have to consider the role of religion in our national life. An epic battle for the Bible is now underway in a country that has been largely ceded to white evangelical Christian nationalists. Through a well-funded network of churches and nonprofits, universities, and think tanks, and with direct lines to the nation's highest political officials, they've had carte blanche to set the terms of what passes for religious debate in this country, and dictate what morality even means in our society. Under Trump, such religious nationalism has reached a fever pitch as a reactionary movement that includes technocratic billionaires, televangelists, and armed militias, has taken root with a simple enough message: God loves white Christian America, favors small government and big business, and rewards individualism and entrepreneurship. Meanwhile, the poor, people of color, and immigrants are blamed for society's problems even as the rich get richer in what's still the wealthiest country in the history of the world. The dangers posed by today's Christian nationalists are all too real, but the battle for the Bible itself is not new in America. In the 1700s and 1800s, slaveholders quoted the Book of Philemon and lines from St. Paul's epistles to claim that slavery was ordained by God. They also ripped the pages of Exodus from Bibles they gave to the enslaved. During the Gilded Age of the 19th century, churches and politicians alike preached a prosperity gospel that extolled the virtues of industrial capitalism. Decades later, segregationists continued to use stray biblical verses to rubber-stamp Jim Crow practices. while in the late 1970s the moral majority helped to mainstream a new generation of Christian extremists into national politics. In my own youth, I remember politicians quoting Thessalonians in the lead up to the passage of the 1996 Welfare Reform Act as proof that God believes in work requirements for public assistance programs. Students of religion and history know that, although such theological battles have often tipped disastrously toward the forces of violence, deprivation, and hate, Christian religious thinking has also been a key ingredient in positive social change in this country. Escaped slave Harriet Moses Tubman understood the Underground Railroad as a Christian project of liberation, while escaped slave Frederick Douglass fought for abolition through churches across the North in the pre-Civil War years. A century later, near the end of his life, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. explained how, to achieve his universal dream of justice, a beloved community of God would be built through a freedom church of the poor. After all, in every chapter of American history, abolitionists, workers, labor organizers, civil rights leaders, and other representatives of the oppressed have struggled for a better nation. Not just in streets and workplaces, but in the pulpit, too. In the wreckage of the present Trumpian moment, with a fascistic, white nationalism increasingly ascendant, people of conscience would do well to follow suit.
The convergence of poverty and religion in the Bible Belt has a long history, stretching back to the earliest settler colonists. In the slave era, it echoed through the system of Jim Crow that had the region in its grip until the civil rights years, and the modern political concept of the Solid South, once Democratic, now Republican. Within its bounds lies a brutal legacy of divide and conquer that, to this day, politicizes the Bible by claiming that poverty results from sins against God, and teaches poor white people, in particular, that, although they may themselves have little or nothing, they are at least better than people of color.